Greetings, everyone. Welcome to JB Morning Talk Show. Today we have Bruce Affleck. He is an accomplished legal profession with a significant impact in civil rights and the constitutional law. He actually also represents the ICC case against Museveni and his son. Praise Bruce. Thanks for honoring our invitation. I know you are very busy, but thank you for honoring our invitation for today's JB Morning Talk Show. And please say hi to our viewers before we get started.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be back here with JB. As you know, I'm Bruce Affleck, and I'm Bobby Wine's attorney and the attorney for those who are filing papers in the ICC. But more broadly, I've been representing the NUP and Bobby Wine and this cause, throughout the world, talking to different people in different forums. So it's good to be here with everyone again today, and JB does a great job in running this show.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce, for that. Now, getting started. On the 30th of this past month, that's April, this year, the United Kingdom imposed sanctions on the Speaker of Parliament of Uganda, that is Anita Among, and two other former ministers for corruption and misappropriation of iron sheets meant for the poor people in Karamoja. Could you provide an insight into the legal implications and the potential consequences for the individuals involved, both in terms of their personal status and their ability to carry out their duties and functions within the government?
Well, JB, as a lawyer, sometimes people say we can't be brief, but I'll try to do both. Explain and be brief as well. These sanctions are very important because it really represents the first time the UK has taken firm action against Uganda's government. Now, they didn't bring sanctions against Museveni or his son, but Speaker Among is among the highest people within the NRM and in the governing party apparatus. And this is an important statement. Now, it's interesting, JB, the parliament representative in Uganda said, oh, this is about the anti-homosexuality law. This is Britain's way of objecting to that. I don't think that's what's happening here. And I don't think Britain would bring sanctions against the Speaker of Parliament simply because of that. I think we have to look at what's really going on. They're charged with corruption, about taking metal from a community construction program. I don't think the UK would get involved in that unless it was trying to send a stronger message. So first of all, JB, these sanctions are very serious. Anyone sanctioned, and the two ministers and Speaker Among, can no longer do any business in the UK. They can no longer send or receive any money through UK banks. They can't go to the UK or any UK territories. That will probably be honored by places like Canada and Australia as well. They are unable to do any business of any kind with anyone within the United Kingdom. So this is a very serious ban. They can't travel even to the UK. Now, for a leader in a Commonwealth country like Uganda, that's a serious burden. Now, undoubtedly, the EU will also begin to look at serious travel restraints, as will the US as to these people. Now, let's examine what's really happening here. Would the UK have done this just because of sheet metal that's taken from a community construction program? I don't think so. I think what's happening here is something more serious. You know, just last year, or early in the year, the US struck off Uganda from the AGOA, special preference for African agricultural products. And the stated reason was very blunt, because of the human rights violations. And this wasn't just a sanction against a few officials. Uganda itself is now taken out of AGOA because President Biden said its human rights record violates international law. So that's very important. So I think this is the UK's way of following on that and sending a message to Museveni and Muhoozi that we're no longer going to be tolerating this kind of conduct by Uganda. We're going to start to crack down. And I think this is the UK's way of answering both what President Biden did and what we did in the ICC. We documented hundreds of cases of torture against NUP members, against ordinary citizens. And I think the UK is now responding to that. They don't want to so directly burn the bridges yet, but they're using this sheet metal as a way of sending a signal that the worm is turning, and Museveni needs to know that.
Bruce, following the imposition of sanctions, the Uganda government stated recently its intention to engage with the United Kingdom regarding the rationale behind these actions. Now, we would love to know, is there a possibility for sanctions to be reversed? And if so, under what conditions or terms could this occur? Because if they are ready to engage, definitely, maybe there is a possibility that the sanctions can be reversed.
Well, JB, I think that's Uganda's government saying we want to talk to the UK. But the UK didn't talk to Uganda first. It issued the sanctions under the UK Global Anti-Corruption Act. So Uganda may want to talk to the UK about the rationale behind the sanctions, but that doesn't mean the UK is going to speak to Uganda. And I think that's a very important distinction. The UK would not have done this if it was prepared to negotiate and remove these later. I think the UK government would be very embarrassed if it backed out so quickly, especially when the US has sanctioned the entire agricultural industry in Uganda because of the government's human rights record. I don't think the UK is going to back down.
Crossing over to the United States, in its country report on Uganda, the United States Department of State documents the extensive crackdown on leaders and supporters of NUP by the Museveni regime. The report highlights the extrajudicial killing of NUP supporters, including Mzee Costa Muhonja, who was tortured to death in February while in police custody. It also details incidents of the abduction, torture, and detention without trial of NUP supporters like Olivia Lutaya on politically motivated charges. However, the report couldn't capture all details as some are still ongoing and being documented. Like a few weeks ago, an activist by the name Masaba Faustin was abducted and still held in Communicado. Bruce, could this human rights report on Uganda support calls for additional sanctions? Can it be used as a tool to call for sanctions? Does it meet the criteria for such action? And if so, what legal avenues could be pursued?
Well, JB, I think the report itself is a very important development. The US has been a close ally of Uganda under Museveni. Museveni is a part of the US military strategy in Africa and even in Iraq to a degree. And the Uganda military has been close to the US. But now the US is starting to seriously distance itself from Uganda. You know, the Biden withdrawal from AGOA. Now the Human Rights Report, which really is a very strong condemnation. And all of this follows, well, the Human Rights Report follows our ICC submission. Now, I want to point out something to everyone listening. The US does not have our ICC affidavits. Those are confidential. And everyone who gave those to us, they do not go to any other government, they go to the ICC. So the US was working on its own information, which was very strong as well. So I think this shows, JB, that the US is now getting tougher and is going to push harder as to Uganda. And this is very significant because in the next election, Uganda is going to find it much harder to commit fraud and get away with it. If the Biden administration is now doing these two things, withdrawing Uganda from the African Agricultural Preference Program, which is vital to Uganda because Uganda is an agricultural country, and then it issues a country report condemning very grossly these human rights violations. I think that means that if Museveni attempts to defraud the electorate again, the United States is actually not going to accept that. JB, these two developments are very important. Removing Africa from the Agricultural Preference Program, that's a major blow, removing Uganda. That's a major blow. Uganda is an agricultural country. And one of the easiest things it can export is agricultural products. And then the country report, which completely condemns the human rights violations. Now, the U.S. doesn't have all of the detail we have and that we gave to the ICC. But the U.S. report is still pretty broad and blunt and condemns Uganda's government outright. These two things tell us that the next time there's an election, and it's going to be coming up, Museveni is not going to be easily able to get away with committing a fraudulent election return. The U.S. is demonstrating now, it's now willing to distance itself from Uganda's government, and it's not going to accept a fraudulent election the next time around. And that vote's going to get closer and closer, and it's going to be much harder for Museveni to defraud the voters this time. And the U.S. is not going to be quietly accepting that. I want to add one more thing, JB. You remember when the violence just before the last election in November 2020 took place? That was in the last months of Donald Trump's presidency. President Trump at the time directed the Secretary of State to issue a very strong condemnation of the abuses that we saw in the end of the campaign in the last election. Then the Biden administration came in, and it took time to get back on track, but now it's getting tougher again. If President Trump comes back, I think Museveni is going to find he has a very strong opponent in office, because President Trump, just before he left office, issued a very strong condemnation as to human rights abuses by the Museveni government. And if President Trump comes back, we're going to see a much tougher U.S. policy. And we may be able to see the beginning of the end of this regime. And President Biden, as we see, is also becoming tougher as well. There's less and less tolerance in the U.S. for this kind of abusive government.
Yes, Bruce. Could you please throw more light on the issue of using the Human Rights Report on Uganda as a tool to call for more sanctions on targeted individuals?
Oh, yes, certainly. Thank you, JB, for reminding me on that additional issue. The report itself is the basis for sanctions in the U.S. Human rights abuses in the U.S. lead directly to sanctions. Unlike other countries, our laws allow human rights abuses to be the basis for very severe sanctions. And those include complete inability to use the U.S. banking system, and that really means the world banking system, because really the U.S. controls access to most international banks, no travel to the United States, no business in the U.S. So anyone put under those sanctions basically is out of business, and any individual or company. So the new report, the new human rights report, absolutely provides a basis for those additional sanctions. And it also tells us the U.S. is going to continue to work in that direction, because these reports are always updated. As you just pointed out, with the loss of Masaba Faustin.
Yeah, Masaba Faustin.
We see more and more cases arising. And so the U.S. pays attention to those. The next report is going to be even tougher. And so that report absolutely can be the basis for sanctions. Eventually, frankly, I think Museveni himself will be subject to those sanctions, because it's clear who is issuing the orders and who is running this operation. Now, we already identified that General Muhoozi, in three separate instances, has been identified as being the director of the government's torture operation. And that's been submitted to the ICC. That eventually can be given to the United States Department of State, and they could very seriously examine that evidence and consider sanctions against General Muhoozi. So the fact that Britain and the U.S. are both ratcheting up the pressure, this tells us that this regime is going to be in trouble.
Yes, of course, we can swear it's heading the sanctions, decide the human rights report on Uganda, and then the ICC. Actually, Bruce, the last time you were here, you hinted on the name Anita Among as one of those dragged to the International Criminal Court. Now, here comes fresh sanctions against the same person from the United Kingdom, moreover. I want you to elaborate briefly. What good does this serve to the case at the ICC? Because you are at the forefront of this.
Well, you know, it's interesting that on their face, the sanctions are about stealing metal. Yeah. So it doesn't directly relate to human rights abuses. But it's obviously been issued not because of the metal, but because of the human rights situation. This is the UK's way of making a starting point. And I think the ICC will understand that point. And the combination of the US and the UK sanctions and reports will, I think, be important to the ICC in evaluating this. So we'll be actually supplementing at the appropriate time our papers to bring that forward to the ICC. I think this will be very important to the ICC. Now, we also have to remember the ICC is a unique court. It doesn't have unlimited resources. It spent a great deal of time on Ukraine and still is. It's now apparently looking carefully at events in Gaza and in Israel, and with respect to the Hamas attacks as well. And so they take their time, they have to. But they are going to look at our papers, they are looking at our papers, and that process will continue. And it's a powerful tool because the leaders of Uganda know that these bodies, these courts, these governments are looking after them, out for them. And not to protect them, but the worm is turning. These leaders in Uganda are now on the defensive, and we can see that happening more and more through all of these different actions. So I believe this will be very important to the ICC because it shows an international trend, and that's important as well.
Of course, why all this is happening is because our courts are under the pocket of Mr. Museveni. He decides who goes to prison, who comes out, and all that kind of thing. Could be the sanctions and the pressure from those that support him, from those that finance him. That pressure will do something. Now, Bruce, there is a perception in the media that once the United Kingdom imposes sanctions on an individual, it is more likely that other countries such as the USA, Canada, and Europe may follow suit. Actually, in your previous submission, you hinted on it as well. So could you elaborate more on the feasibility of this happening and what role Ugandans can play to influence such actions? Because I tell you, Ugandans would love Canada, USA, Europe, and all the neighboring countries slapping sanctions on these officials that violate the rights of Ugandans.
Thank you, JB. I think that's an important question. First of all, I think the EU and Canada and maybe Australia and countries like that will certainly be giving serious thought to sanctions against Uganda. There is a growing intolerance in the West for this constant dictatorship and human rights abuses. The very fact that both the US and the UK are now doing this, I think is going to encourage the EU, Canada, Australia to impose sanctions. And once that happens, that net is surrounding these people. And they can't go anywhere. They can't do any business. They can't do any banking. They can't travel, except to other disfavored regimes. So this is a very important step, and I believe the EU especially will take an interest. And I want to point out, the EU was one of the biggest supporters of Bobi Wine's international call to condemn the human rights abuses in Uganda. And I think they're going to seriously look at all of these developments and may very well issue similar rulings, or member states will. One of the things ordinary Ugandans can do is to directly call the EU. It's actually very easy. Anyone with the internet can contact the EU's Human Rights Office, its Foreign Affairs Office, and any member of the European Union Parliament. Anyone with access to the internet can do all of this and bring forth these issues. They will listen, and they're interested and concerned. The EU has been very supportive of our attempts internationally to call attention to the torture and abuses. So every citizen of Uganda who can get to a computer at a library, their own computer, their phone, their friend's phone, can contact the EU, can contact the Canadian embassy or the Canadian consulate, the Australian embassy, the Australian consulate, the Italian, and any country that are members of the EU. These countries can be easily reached. And if Ugandans would begin to do this, that would make a difference internationally.
Well, that sounds great because people are really committed, and I'm very sure very many who did not know about this are going to start on it as allies are today. Now, Bruce, there is this one, of course, about sanctioning juniors and leaving the master untouched. Yes, Ugandans are complaining, and actually, I think they do have a valid point. They argue that it is unfair to sanction the juniors and leave the master untouched. Are there any precedents or legal frameworks that could be applied in the case of Museveni? Should there be a concerted effort to sanction him? How might such efforts be viewed in the broader context of international law and diplomacy?
Well, I don't think people should be frustrated that the junior people are being attacked. First of all, the speaker is not junior. She's an important figure in the government. I think what's important to remember is that this is happening and is starting and is growing. That's the point. You know, you start smaller and you get bigger. So it's natural these governments will send a message focusing on some of the lower ranking people. Eventually that message will have to go higher and higher and will eventually reach those who are truly in charge of the abuses. So people should not be disappointed. You know, everyone likes to complain. That's true, right, JP? I mean, let's face it. In politics, everyone wants to complain. But you got to look at what's really happening here. What's really happening is a change in the attitude of the US and the UK, especially the UK. And the UK used to hold back and give Uganda a free hand because the UK had an old colonial interest there and sort of wanted to recapture that. But now the UK is being tougher. Going after the speaker was a big gesture. It's not a small gesture. It's not going after a junior. It's sending a message. People need to know the work we've done and are doing is taking root internationally. President Biden started off backing off on criticizing Museveni, but not anymore. Now we see he's cut out Uganda from the trade group, and they issued a direct, strong country report condemning broad human rights abuses, not by junior officials, but by the government that Museveni runs. These are big steps, so people in Uganda need to see it that way. And remember, things take a little time, but these are big steps, and they're growing out of what we started. What we started with the ICC and our international press conferences. So people need to remember those are big steps. But really, freedom is not won by complaining. You know, freedom's won by doing and taking action. You know, complaining might make you feel good, but it's not going to do anything. People need to start to say to themselves, I'll take action. I need to do that. And groups need to take action. And then eventually things change. Because there are still decent people in Uganda's government. And once the Ugandan people stand up, those people will begin to be stronger. And so it's important for people to gain liberty on their own. It can't only be done from the outside. It's got to be done from the inside too. And the first step, JB, is to stop complaining. Do. Don't complain, do.
Yes, Bruce, still on that note, what can you say about the issue of Museveni not sanctioned yet?
I'd say the word yet is right there. Eventually it will happen. And it has happened to leaders. It's happened to Putin. It happened to the leader of Serbia, who was actually not only sanctioned, but thrown in prison eventually. So eventually those sanctions will touch ground and where we want them to. This is a big step. And I will stress, JB, Britain going after the speaker and 2 ministers or former ministers, that is not small. Those are high-ranking officials. The U.S. issuing that country report is not small. It's a governmental condemnation of Uganda's government. And people need to realize, with the U.S. such a big military supporter of Uganda, for the U.S. to issue that report condemning Museveni's government, that is not small. That is big. And I think people in Uganda need to realize the work we've done is starting to take root. But Ugandans need to do that work too. Bobby's doing it, NUP people are doing it. We need ordinary Ugandans also to do it.
Yes, Bruce, as we wind up the show, let us also say something about AGOA. You and me both know at the start of this year, actually it was the 1st of January 2024, Uganda was suspended from AGOA due to its human rights record under Museveni. But of course, just like, dictators, Museveni is not going to fold his arms. He's going to fight back. And on this note, concerning individuals illegally representing Uganda to reinstate AGOA, Museveni's son-in-law, that is Odrek Ravogo, of course, was sent to the United States by Museveni, to cut deals and reinstate AGOA. But recently, he appointed Oliver Kamanzi, who is representing the government of Uganda, without being registered with the Department of Justice FARA office. Now, I want you to expound more on this and explain very well, because these people, they are illegally representing Uganda. They are being presented as trade representatives, but they are not registered by FARA. So, what actions can be taken in response to this? Because this is really very serious.
Well, certainly if someone's representing Uganda as a private citizen in the U.S., but isn't registering, that's a criminal offense in the United States.
Yes.
And that could be prosecuted. It can be brought to the attention of the Justice Department. We can do that. That would be an important step to take. But remember, we also don't want to cut off all communication. It's important that people speak to our government here and tell Museveni the way it is. Because no one in our government is going to close their eyes anymore to torture or human rights abuses. So when Museveni sends someone here or asks someone here to speak for him, they're going to get an honest answer from the United States, and Museveni is going to hear that. And so it's important that he hear that message. So it's not wrong that someone speaks to the government for Museveni. In a sense, we want that to happen. We want that message to be sent back to Uganda. But I think the fact that he's using people who are in the U.S. also shows that it's dangerous for Ugandan officials to leave the country, because they never know if the ICC has an indictment against them. And they never know whether or not the U.S. or some other country is going to bring some sort of charges against them. So the fact that he had to use someone in the U.S. who needed to register actually tells us that they're unwilling to send people here sometimes because they're fearful of what may happen legally. So I think we're making inroads into the government.
Bruce, as we wind up today's show, this is the last one. It's about different forms of sanctions. There are various forms someone can be sanctioned. Could you explain to our viewers today the best choice, especially in the fight against dictators like Museveni?
I'm not an absolute expert on sanctions, of course, but I am a lawyer and I'm very well versed in international law and U.S. law in general. Sanctions in the U.S. for human rights violations are very, very broad. When someone is sanctioned in that way, they're blocked from the banking system. And that's huge, because the banking system of the U.S. is the world banking system. If you can't get onto the U.S. banking system, there's very little you can do. Travel is banned to the U.S. Once the U.S. bans travel of a high Ugandan official under our sanctions, that's going to take root elsewhere. And so more and more of those options of Ugandan officials are going to narrow once we impose sanctions. No business can be done under these sanctions in the United States. All accounts in the U.S. of the sanctioned person are frozen. So these are very powerful tools. And different dimensions of them can be used, but I've described the range of sanctions. In general, though, when someone is sanctioned for violating human rights, all of these kick in. I hope that's a good answer, JB. I don't know if that helps the listeners, but there are these four major areas. No use of the banking system. No business can be conducted in the U.S. No travel to the U.S. And property in the U.S. will be confiscated and held in a trust account. You'll be deprived of your property if you're sanctioned. So these are powerful tools. Any one of them is powerful.
So basically, it's all about focusing more on the reasons that bring about the sanctions, and then those slapping the sanctions will identify which one fits who.
I think that's right. The slapper will identify how far they slap. But usually when someone's sanctioned for major human rights violations, all of it is done. And this is a powerful, powerful tool. And I believe we will eventually get to the point of sanctioning Museveni and his son, General Muhoozi. We're not there yet, but it takes time. But we're seeing the cracks in the dam. The UK and the US actions are showing the beginning of a change. And as we get towards the next election in Uganda, it's going to be impossible for the government to fraudulently deprive people of their choice. Because every time there's an election, more and more people will vote for the opposition, will vote for the NUP. It's going to get harder for Uganda's government to try to deceive people. And that will become known. So I am very confident that we're going to start to see change in this regime, in association with the next election.
Yes, Bruce, do you have anything to add on? Or any words for our viewers?
And the one thing I'd say to all Ugandans is, number one, have faith that democracy will win out. Every dictator goes down eventually. No dictatorship continues endlessly. And finally, and I've always said this, Ugandans have to play the biggest role in ending this dictatorship. And if that means protesting in the streets, labor union strikes, if that means gathering in the market in a village or in Kampala and standing in silent protest, all of these things have to be done. Ugandans have to take that initiative. And yes, unfortunately, it might mean sometimes people will be hurt. Hopefully not. But it will never happen unless Ugandans say, enough, I've got to take that action. That's how dictatorships end all over the world.
Yes, thank you for that powerful message. It's the only Ugandans that have to step up and take charge. They shouldn't wait for USA. They shouldn't wait for Canada. They shouldn't wait for Europe. They shouldn't wait for anyone from outside Uganda. It's them to take on the dictatorship. Maybe if you have anything else left.
No, JB, I just want to say keep this show going. It is important to Ugandans, and I hope people will not only listen and watch this show, but send it on to others and bring others together to listen. I know not everyone has a smartphone or a computer, but bring people together to listen to this show. When you hear JB's show, go get 10 people to listen. And everyone in Uganda should be doing that so that these messages really are heard through the entire nation. So thank you, JB, for doing what you're doing.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you for honoring our invitation for today's show. It has been a great time having you on the show again. Till next time, thank you. And